Today I will tell you about the most mysterious case of my career, a murder committed in a locked room. The key was in the victim's possession, the doors were locked from the inside, and the only witness claimed that no one entered or exited. How the killer managed to disappear, leaving behind a perfect illusion. I woke up to the sharp ringing of my phone. The clock on my bedside table read 2 in the morning. Such calls usually don't bode well. Picking up the phone, I heard the familiar voice of Captain Reed. "Maxfer, we have a homicide." "A very strange one," he began without preamble. "An old mansion on Ash Street. Victim is the famous writer Harold Miller. Locked room, key in the dead man's hand." Those words immediately perked me up. I've been a detective long enough to know that these cases are a real puzzle. Locked room, that phrase always evoked a mixture of curiosity and professional excitement in me. I quickly gathered myself, threw on an old coat, and stepped out into the rainy night. The drops clattered on the sidewalk, the air was damp and cold. On the way, I went over the details in my head: the writer, the locked room, the key in the victim's hands. It all sounded like the beginning of a novel. The Ash Street mansion greeted me with its grim grandeur. It was an old house with a Gothic facade covered in ivy. In the dim light of the street lamps, it looked like a place where history and mysticism had become one. Captain Reed met me on the porch, tired and a little irritated. "Well, Maxfer, here's your new challenge," he said, gesturing me inside. Inside the mansion there was a silence that immediately struck me as ominous. The forensics team was already working on the first floor, and upstairs was the most mysterious part of the night: the locked room and its dead occupant. The Ash Street mansion has long been a local legend. People whispered about it as a house where the walls remembered more than they should. Its massive door creaked open as I stepped inside. Captain Reed walked ahead, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor. "The victim is Harold Miller, a famous writer," Reed began as we walked up the stairs. The door to the room was locked from the inside. None of the locks had been picked, the windows were impossible to open, and the key was in his hand. "How's that, Maxfer?" "Sounds like one of his own novels," I replied, nodding toward a group of forensic scientists who were arguing about something at the entrance to the room. Once inside, I immediately noticed how perfect the scene looked. Everything seemed to be in its place: a neat desk, a chair, shelves of books. There was a glass of whiskey on the table, and a manuscript lying next to it. But as I looked more closely, strange things began to appear. There was a faint scratch on the floor near the chair, as if something heavy had been moved. The walls of the room were perfectly clean, but one of the window casings looked a little different, like it had been recently touched up. Reed stood nearby, watching me. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think there's a lot of extra piece here," I answered, pointing to a scratch on the floor. "It feels like someone made a special effort to leave a perfect picture." "Well, that's what you're here for," the captain said, nodding. "Harold Miller, 45 years old. His books were in every store, and his name was known even to those who had never picked up a detective book. Ironically, he had died under circumstances that could themselves have been the subject of his new book." There was a manuscript folder on the table. I opened it and ran my eyes over the first lines. The plot centered on a killer who leaves behind perfect crimes without leaving a trace. Coincidence? Unlikely. But that wasn't the only thing that caught my attention. The whiskey glass was half full, but the liquid in it looked slightly cloudy. I leaned over to inhale the odor, a faint chemical tinge. Looking around the room further, I found another detail: a clock on the wall. It showed 9 o'clock in the evening, but the seconds hand had stopped between 2 divisions. That meant that the murder had happened at that exact time, but then why hadn't anyone heard anything? The housekeeper, who stood outside the threshold of the room, looked pale. She timidly stepped forward when I asked, "Did you hear anything unusual last night?" "No, sir." "It was quiet," she replied, looking down at the floor. Her answer only heightened my interest. If it was quiet, how did the killer get in and out? And more importantly, why would he leave the scene like that? I paced the room for a long time, putting the puzzle pieces together in my head. The scratch on the floor, the faint chemical odor, the stopped clock. All of these things clearly indicated that the scene had been created with the intent to mislead us. Captain Reed stood at the door with his arms crossed over his chest. "What do you think, Maxfer? Could it be suicide?" he said doubtfully. "It's too clean to be suicide," I said, pointing to the table. "Look how neatly arranged the items are. It all looks like someone's made a special effort to leave us a spectacle." My thoughts were interrupted by the housekeeper, who reappeared at the threshold of the room. "Pardon me, sir, but this may be important," she began, looking at me hesitantly. "I heard footsteps last night. They were quite quiet, as if someone was trying to keep the noise down." "Footsteps? Where exactly?" I asked, turning sharply. "In the hallway, near the stairs. But I thought it was Mr. Miller himself." "I didn't think much of it," she added, lowering her eyes. It changed the course of my thoughts. If someone was really in the house, he knew how to move to remain undetected. But how did he leave a room that was locked from the inside? I examined the window again. The frame was ancient, but the lock mechanism looked suspiciously new. I checked it carefully and felt it give in slightly when I pressed on a certain point. It could be a loophole, but I wasn't sure yet. "Captain," I said, turning to Reed, "I think we need to check to see who came into the house last night." The next day I returned to the house with equipment for a more thorough inspection. The morning brought a bright light that highlighted details that had slipped away during the night. The first thing I noticed were small footprints in the carpet near the chair. They were barely recognizable, but clearly indicated that someone had been standing there for a long time. But why? My attention was drawn to the whiskey glass that the forensics team had not had time to pick up. I examined it carefully and noticed that there were marks on the edges that looked like a powdery residue. I handed the glass to Captain Reed. "Check the contents." "It might be something interesting," I said. The next stop was the desk. I opened the manuscript folder again. One of the paragraphs talked about a killer who used a clever mechanism to create the illusion that he couldn't have been at the crime scene. Coincidence or clue? On the back page of the manuscript, I found a strange drawing, a sort of diagram. It showed a room, a window, and some kind of mechanism that could have triggered the door locking system. "Maxfer, this is too much," Reed said, looking over my shoulder. "Are you saying this guy described his own murder?" "Maybe he knew all too well that someone was going to try to kill him," I replied, setting the sheets aside. This finding suggested that Miller might have known he was going to die in advance. But then why all of this? A closed room, a carefully constructed scene. While the lab was checking the contents of the glass, I decided to revisit my conversation with the housekeeper. There was clearly something she wasn't telling me. We met in the kitchen. The woman was nervously washing dishes, avoiding looking in my direction. "Do you know anything about the diagram I found on the table?" I asked. She flinched, but quickly pulled herself together. "No, sir. I did not interfere in Mr. Miller's affairs." Her voice sounded uncertain and her hands trembled. "I thought I'd come at it from a different angle. You said you heard footsteps. Are you sure it wasn't Mr. Miller? The woman hesitated, then shook her head. No. Those footsteps were too light. Maybe it was one of his guests. What guests? I frowned. She hesitated. Sometimes people came to see him in the evenings. I didn't know who they were. This information gave me a new lead. If Miller really did have visitors, one of them could have been involved in his death. While I pondered her words, Captain Reed returned with the results of the analysis. There was a trace of a strong tranquilizer in the glass, he reported. Someone wanted to sedate the victim. Or make him unable to resist, I muttered. Things were getting even more confusing. Now I needed to know who had come to Miller's house in the last days before his death. The next step was to find out who had visited Miller's house in recent days. To that end, I went to a cafe near his mansion where, according to the housekeeper, he often met people. The barista, an older man with a keen eye, immediately remembered Miller. Yeah, he used to come here a lot. He'd been acting strange lately. Always sitting in the corner, looking out the window and making notes in a notebook, he said, pointing to a table by the window. And the guests? I asked. The barista nodded. There was usually one person, a tall man in a trench coat. They would discuss something and then leave together. It was curious. The tall man in the cloak. His description matched the figure I'd seen on the surveillance camera near the mansion. I went back to the police station to study the tape more closely. The tape showed the shadow of a man entering Miller's house on the evening of the murder. The camera caught him going in but not coming out. This confirmed my theory. The killer had somehow used the escape mechanism. Reed, I called the captain. We need to find out who this man is. Send a request to the cafe, have them check their security footage. While Reed made the request, I re-examined the schematic I'd found in the manuscript. It looked too complex to be just a fantasy. Perhaps Miller had left it as a warning or a coded clue. Whoever the tall man was, I was sure he was a clue. That same evening, Reed brought in the printouts from the cafe's cameras. The man's face on the footage appeared familiar. He was Thomas Wilson, a former engineer who worked for the construction firm that had once restored the Miller mansion. He might have known how the locks and mechanisms in the house worked, I said thoughtfully. Do you think he might have been involved? Reed asked. I'm more than sure, I replied. But why would he do that? I decided to track Wilson down. They found him in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. He didn't look frightened, but rather annoyed, like a man who'd been distracted from important matters. Maxfer? He asked, frowning. Do you want to talk about Miller? Yes, Thomas. And I think you know more about the case than you want to admit, I answered, looking him hard in the eye. He grinned. Miller was smart, but overconfident. He knew someone was out to take him down, but he kept playing his games anyway. Games? What games? I interjected. Thomas was silent for a moment, then added. He was collecting dirt. He was writing a book that could destroy several powerful people. All I did was help him with the castle. Nothing more. Then why were you at his house on the day of the murder? I asked, showing him the picture from the camera. Thomas fell silent. His face turned pale. I didn't do anything, he whispered. Thomas had been arrested, but I knew he was only part of the mosaic. He told how he helped Miller install a complex mechanism in the room that allowed the door to be locked from the outside. According to Thomas, Miller feared for his life but didn't trust the police, so he preferred to defend himself. But that only explained part of the mystery. Who killed him? I went back to Miller's house to study the manuscript again. On one of the last pages was a list of names: politicians, businessmen, lawyers. These were the people the dirt could destroy. There was one name I couldn't ignore: George Bailey, a lawyer who often worked with Miller. I tracked him down at the office. To my surprise, he confessed right away. "Yes, I did," he said coldly. Miller had become too dangerous. He was smart, but he didn't know when to stop. "But how did you enter the room?" I asked. "Through the window." Thomas had created the mechanism, but I found a way to use it against Miller. The case was closed, but I was left with a bitter residue. It was all just part of a bigger game. Maybe George wasn't acting alone.